This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to that question of what is technology. I always pose that to my students as I start talking about this. And 90% of the time, the first 2 or 3 answers are examples of technology. So I'll get, my smartphone, my computer, internet, etc. And all of that is true in some sense. That's a form of technology or a type of technology. But I always say, I say, what is technology? Let's start thinking philosophically, like what is it at its core? And then the answer to that question directly informs what we do about it. But what happens, especially in kind of contemporary societies, we often want to jump to the symptom and provide some type of solution rather than kind of getting to the core. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to open this volume up with a study on kind of a philosophy of technology. Is let's ask some of the baseline kind of fundamental questions, because that'll directly influence how we answer them and how we move forward in our increasingly digital public square. So that question of what is technology, it's funny though, because that introduces the idea. But after I've introduced kind of the paradigm and the 2 kind of main approaches and kind of hopefully started to craft kind of a specifically Christian philosophy of technology, I have to come back to that same question. Because the question is, I see what you're saying, that technology forms us and shapes us. It's not just the tool itself. It's not neutral. I get all of that. But isn't it just a tool? Like, isn't it just a tool that we use for good or for bad type of thing? How is it really forming and shaping me? How is it this kind of larger kind of culture or force? And so you have to keep coming back to that, because I think most of us, at least in my tradition, are raised seeing technology as just merely a tool. It's a tool for good. It can be used for good, for bad, but it's just neutral. And I think kind of shifting and breaking that up and saying, there's actually a lot more going on here can really be eye-opening and kind of shift and change our perspective and engagement with technology today.
Yeah, so just to wit, when I ask students what is technology, then I have to say, a pencil is technology.
Exactly.
An iron axe head is technology. Even I just bought new barefoot shoes. I don't know what you call them. Not the kind with the finger toes.
Gotcha.
I haven't gone that weird yet. But just there's no sole to them except for a thin piece of rubber. And I immediately, within one day, I felt new muscles in my calves because I was walking differently, because I was, walking on concrete here in New York City, 20,000 steps a day in these no-sole shoes. My legs started reshaping their habits in accordance with this new touch to the ground sensation that I was feeling. So even if people list off things that they think are technology. I find that when you ask what is technology, people just think technology equals electric or digital, and that's about the end of the conversation. So what is technology for you?
Yeah, when I ask that question, as I said, I normally get kind of digital technologies, but you're exactly right. And I always tell my students, I say, you know what the most revolutionary form of technology in all of human history likely is? And it's some debate on this. I say it's actually the printing press, at least the way I look at it. Is it revolutionized and changed an entire society? It changed the way we thought. It changed the way we engaged with people. It changed the way that we organized society even. And so kind of getting out of that paradigm that we're not just talking about digital technologies. We're talking about all forms of technology, from the hoe and the shovel all the way up to my iPhone, helps us, I think, in many ways to have that broader perspective. But one of the things I do in that chapter is I lean heavily on a gentleman named Jacques Ellul. He's a French sociologist. He's a Protestant thinker. It's funny to me when you read studies about Ellul or engagement with Ellul, you typically have a lot of people of no faith or kind of non-religious engagement with him, and they like him or hate him. They love him or hate him type of thing.
That's true. He really does split the difference, right?
Or on the other side, there's like this distinctly Christian engagement or religious engagement, and they either love him or hate him. But the interesting thing is most people don't realize he's writing on both sides. He's writing as a sociologist and kind of studying culture and these movements, but doing so as a Protestant. And Ellul, for me, I don't love everything about Ellul. I actually disagree with Ellul a good bit.
Mm-hmm.
But what Ellul did for me and why he's so formative is he kind of shook me a little bit. Because if you'd asked me 5 or 6 years ago, what is technology? I said, oh, it's a tool. That's just kind of how I was raised. That's the culture in which I inhabit. That's so almost second nature to me. Ellul said, whoa. Let's slow down and ask some deeper questions. Let's think about it as he frames. He doesn't say technology. He says technique. Mm-hmm. And we might think, oh, that's just a fancy French way of saying technology. It kind of is. But what Ellul, how he's using it, he doesn't mean the machines or tools. He's talking about these larger techniques or movements or cultures that we have mechanical techniques, we have psychological techniques. There's all these forms of technique, but they all have one purpose, to this drive towards efficiency. As I'll also say, convenience, efficiency, better, faster, stronger. And this is the almost autonomous will of technology. And so while I don't go completely deterministic like he does, I say that pulls me away from this kind of instrumentalist approach, this kind of tool-based approach to say there's a lot more going on here. And I think, and this is not just original to me, John Dyer from Dallas Theological Seminary, Derek Sherman at Calvin University have written on this extensively, that Postman and Ellul kind of fall into that deterministic camp. And then you have this kind of tool-based camp. Both of them have a lot of benefits. Both of them have a lot of truths. And I think a distinctly Christian philosophy of technology that I'm working toward in that chapter takes the best of both and pulls it in and say, yes, it is a tool. You are a moral agent. You are morally responsible. You do use these things, but they're also using you. They're shaping you. They're forming you in often subtle but yet distinct ways, whether it's the muscles in your calf from a shoe like that, or this kind of constant, almost low-level anxiety we feel of we're missing something. What's going on? What did my phone just light up? Where's my phone? Have you seen my phone? Like, we just feel drawn to these devices. And I think that's one of the ways that technology is shaping us. And so I always describe it as it's a tool it's not neutral by any means. It's kind of like a toy hammer. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's what Neil Postman, he updated that to say that, if you have a camera, everything looks like a picture. Jacob Schatzer, who wrote in the volume, also says if you have a smartphone with a camera, everything looks like a status update. And I love that. And that idea is that these are tools. We use them, but they're also shaping and forming us, our perspective of God, ourselves, and the world around us in very distinct and yet subtle ways. And I think that's what I try to do in organizing and editing this volume, is to cause Christians to slow down and to ask them really fundamental questions about technology, what it is, how it's shaping us, and then what do we do about it.
Now, you use this category, and the book we're talking about is The Digital Public Square, but you use the category deterministic, and I'm going to guess some listeners don't know what you mean by that, or they only heard Calvin, which would be wrong as well. But so what did you mean by deterministic when you talk about technology?
Yeah, so there's two primary views of technology, philosophical views. That is instrumentalist, which I always it's an instrument, it's a tool.
Right.
Then you have this deterministic, and depends on who's using that term exactly what they mean. But deterministic in an Ellulian sense is this kind of autonomous, almost unstoppable kind of force, kind of cultural pressure, this drive almost towards efficiency that we almost, and he doesn't like this, he bristles at it in the introduction to the English version of Technological Society. He kind of bristles at it to say, I'm not talking about this autonomous will. I'm not saying that humans are passive and that we have no control, but I'm almost saying that. Like, he almost kind of has to double back on it and say, barring a miraculous event of everyone waking up, a nuclear holocaust of some sort, which is a very real fear at the time that he's writing this in the 50s and 60s of nuclear annihilation, or this kind of mass awakening in society. Reality is we're not going to be able to stop this drive towards efficiency. So a deterministic in this kind of Ellulian sense is this unstoppable nature to technology, this predetermined kind of outcome, that it's something that it's shaping us and it's forming us. And often he'll say it, technology and even propaganda often have the same unwelcomed character for men. Meaning that it's almost discipling us and shaping us in ways that aren't good, that they kind of have these negative, non-human centered ends. And And that's one of the ways that he's kind of using that deterministic frame. You see this, though, like Karl Marx and kind of technological determinism means something a little different for him. So I want to make sure that for listeners' sake, when you're engaging that, you realize that's a very broad concept that Ellul's using in a very particular way on this unstoppable, autonomous kind of form of technology.
Thanks for that clarification, but it also brings into view that, if you focus just on the tool, the pencil, for example, I mean, there's this famous economist essay called "This is a Pencil," I think. Do you know this essay?
I've heard of it. I don't think I've read it though.
It's a short read, but essentially it just goes through like every element of the pencil and how it was crafted. Like you just have this finely crafted thing that represents resources from around the world and human effort over generations and generations that have finally gotten down to this thing. And if I could jam these two discussions of the economic value of the pencil and the technological view of the pencil, is that when you're looking at a pen or a pencil or something as a tool, you're missing that it comes out of like layers and layers of culture and design as well. And I think that's why the neutrality issue becomes like, when I carried an M16 AR-15 when I was in the military in a combat zone, like it was designed to do certain things in that circumstance, right? And so there's some ways in which it's silly to say, well, it's just a tool and it's neutral, right? Yeah. And so I think that's getting at that all of these tools have their own biographies to them, their own cultural histories, their own material histories, gets into the role they play within our society as well.
Yeah, technology has values. It has an inherent set of values, not only in its design, but also in its intended use. And I think we fail to think about that sometimes, especially with modern technologies, digital technologies specifically, that these things are created for us to engage them in particular ways. Why do you think that your phone constantly reminds you, breaking news this, and half the time it's not really breaking news? What is its design? It's designed to get you to open up the app or to click on that article. There's a design because, especially today, and something we kind of unpack a little bit, and I'm doing in some forthcoming work on privacy, is that we live in kind of not only an information age, but we live in as many before me have said, an attention economy. That they want our eyeballs because they're trying to motivate us to respond in a particular way. And I say they very broadly. The technology companies, individuals, all sorts of people, when we engage these tools, they're created by people for particular reasons with particular values to motivate us to alter our behavior for good or for ill. And so I think when you step back and you go, most people, when you sit and kind of sit in it for a little bit, you realize, it's not just a neutral tool. But it's so tempting to think that when it's just you and your iPhone. And that's when I think one of the reasons I like Ellul so much is that Ellul not only shakes me out of that kind of tool-based approach, but he says what's driving that. And I do think that there's this deep kind of efficiency. That's the word that he uses over and over again throughout his whole work, this drive towards efficiency. I think it was Neil Postman once said, given the decision between a technical and a non-technical means, we inevitably choose the technical means. Why? Because it's faster, it's better, it's more convenient. And that's something that I think is worthy of exploration in light of what does it mean to be human? How do we use these tools? How are they shaping and forming us? And why is this drive towards efficiency seemingly the goal of all technological development?
Yeah, and I think, the issue of efficiency too, you can almost see how it morphs from anybody who's dug a ditch or a foxhole or post holes or whatever. Your material interactions with the world around you will force you to you just say like, okay, I have this much labor left in me. I got to get this done. Is this really the easiest way to do what I'm doing? So, and that might even mean you still use the tool like a shovel, but you use it in a slightly more nuanced way to make the work so you're not spilling as much dirt or whatever. And this has been true for anybody who gets out there and does real work in the real world. But you can imagine how that mentality then shifts over to, well, I've got this program I use, but it's not quite as quick. It takes 7 clicks but it's really not the same though. It's the mentality, but the actual amount of labor left in a human being to do the work is not there. And so I think that, and the reason I'm drawing, I initially studied IO psychology, industrial psychology, and so this comes up a lot in industrial and organizational psychology, is that there really is like a monetization. I mean, you said value, but like under all of this is money, and then under all of that, as Ellul loves to point out, is power and empire, and the goals of empire as well. So maybe connect those dots that I just threw onto the board. Like, what does empire and power and money have to do with technology, and why is the tool view not sufficient for gathering all that together?
Yeah, a tool-based view kind of takes this. It's that neutrality idea. It's just a neutral tool. It's just how you use it. That's what matters. When you take kind of a broader, even more deterministic, which I wouldn't say that I'm deterministic in my understanding of technology either, which, by the way, is a caveat. One of the ways that some philosophers have defined the instrumentalist and deterministic view is to say that the instrumentalist is an optimistic view and the deterministic is a pessimistic view. And I also say, yes, there's good and there's bad here. And so one of the things that happens in these conversations of technologies, we want to know, is it good or bad? Are you an optimist or a pessimist? And I want to say I'm a realist. I realize that there's good here and there's also bad here. Now, sometimes in particular technology, there may be more bad than there's good, and we have to remember that. But even with Ellul, efficiency isn't always bad. And I think that's something we have to realize. Ellul, I think, would understand that. And I don't know if he plays that out as much in his works, that it's not always bad, because he kind of casts it as in this kind of pessimistic, deterministic kind of view. But I do think we have to realize that efficiency isn't always good. Sometimes it's good and helpful, but sometimes it's not. Even thinking of cultivating wisdom. Wisdom doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process. It's not fast. It's not efficient. Actually, it's extremely inefficient, if we're being honest, to gain wisdom. But the value of wisdom outweighs the, quote, benefits of the speed in that moment. But yeah, I mean, even that idea of kind of power and authority and money, often we see that kind of driving a lot of technological developments. One, we think that, especially, let's just take social media, for example. When social media comes onto the scene, look at this amazing way that we can connect with people all around the world. We're going to create rich and vibrant, robust communities. We're going to have this great democratization of information. Everyone's going to have access. We're going to break down the walls, create all these communities.
For our younger listeners, these are things that people actually said.
They actually said this.
And believed them to the core.
And some still do, but many have gone, oh, I don't know about that. Yes, there has been some good. We can't say that it's all bad. But there's also been a lot of negative effects. And I think one of the interesting things, at least for me, is you think of the COVID shutdown, the lockdowns. In the midst of COVID, many people had this kind of more utopian views of technology. When we were thrust into only technical means, it sped up, I think, what would have been our ultimate and kind of long-term reaction to technology. It just kind of sped it up in the midst of a few years. So many of us are going, I just don't want to do another Zoom call. Or, I feel like I'm always on my computer. I really just want to go outside. I just want to go to somebody's house. Like, we realize that technology is not a sufficient replacement or a substitute, but it can be a useful tool. And so you see even that tool language kind of coming back into my conversation. Is I don't want to say that it's not a tool, because it is, but it's still something that we bear that moral responsibility and we have agency over. At the same respect, it is shaping us, informing us in very particular ways. And I think part of a larger culture. And often that culture is driven by power or money, because the reality is those early promises of technology, what were they they gained a lot out of that. When we all started having Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts, because the more we're on these platforms, the more we see the advertising. The more we see the advertising, the more we buy. And then there's a cycle there. There's a lot of money in social media. You think, and we often think, that we have free apps because I can go sign up for Twitter. I can sign up for, maybe you're doing Twitter Blue and paying $8.99 or whatever a month now. I'm not. But we feel like we're getting something for free. In reality, it's not that we're the product, as some have said. And it's not even that our data is the product. We've become kind of almost the fuel. We're our attention. We live in that attention economy, and that's what's being cashed in on. Because how many times have you seen an ad somewhere, clicked on it, and went to go buy something? Somebody made money off that transaction. So if they can get you to see more advertising, maybe you'll spend more money. Or you think in a power dynamic or a power shift is if I'm exposed to X, Y, and Z social ads for some kind of social or ethical issue, maybe I'll vote different. And so that shifts and changes my behavior and shifts the power dynamics in our society. So, and I don't want to go down what's all power or it's all money, because I don't think it's all that. But these are also factors. And this idea of technique, as Ellul would say, that it's not just the machines, it's not just the tools, it's part of these larger structures in society that we need to understand. We need to understand the way that technology is forming and shaping us in those distinct ways.
And, the issue of money and power, or even kind of empire, I mean, there are people who are actively discussing in the government right now whether Facebook should be treated almost as an alternative government. It has a lot of governmental structure and agency in the way that it functions if you compare it to how the government works. So it's not just some technology, it's not just some tool that has entered the space that makes hammering nails easier. I do want to get to some hard cases here in a little bit, but first, there's a theological argument that sounds reminiscent of what you're saying here, and I wonder if it is identical, which is, that sin is just when some good gift of God is used in the wrong time or the wrong context, but otherwise there's some right version of it that's just twisted or corrupted into the wrong. Is it the same? Could that be applied equally to the tool view, or a theological view of the tool? Is that yes, as long as it's in the right context or right time?
I think so. I think there are many who might argue that. I think there's something to that, but again, I think it's maybe a little bit more than that too. The traditional argument would be that God created us. He created everything. He created us as human beings in His image. He gave us authority and power and creativity. He gave us the cultural mandate, and that we were to create and use these tools for the glory of God, the love, Matthew 22, the love of God and love of neighbor. And I think that's true. And then we twisted it based on our sinful desires, rebellion. We twisted and used these tools for ungodly means. That's kind of one version of that argument. And I think that's true in many ways. But I also think that there was even just the idea of an invention or a tool doesn't mean that there's always a good use for it. That there's always kind of an alternative. I think there could be, but I think especially, and I think many of us realize that now, that maybe we're crossing a line. Maybe there are certain tools or technologies that are just not good for us to use, that we shouldn't pursue or we shouldn't develop, because not only will the way they'll be used, but the way that they're already shaping our perception of the world. Many are having this conversation right now about AI. No matter where you fall in the conversation, many are saying, have we reached the point of no return, or have we, and I think some of this is kind of overhype in many ways, as one who's been studying this for a few years. There's always these AI hype cycles, but are we doing something that ought not be done? Are we getting to a place where we just cannot pursue X, Y, and Z technology because of the dangerous ramifications? I think that might be the case. So I don't want to say there's always a flip side. Because sometimes I think there's just negatives, but sometimes I think there are also just positives. There can be good uses of technology. And the same paper that we can print books and Bibles on is the same paper that you can print pornographic magazines on. Like this idea of printing press it's not neutral, because if you study history, you realize the printing press had some pretty widespread effects on society and even on communication with other people and the way that we treat and see other people. And I think that's a whole nother conversation for another day, about the way technology shapes our view of other people and how we interact with people, especially online. They're not just faceless avatars. They're actually human beings created in flesh and blood, just like you and I. That changes how we should interact online. But I want to say that, yes, in some ways that sin is a perversion of the good, but I think there's also a case to be made. There are certain tools and inventions and technologies that maybe ought not be pursued for various reasons. And that's a question of wisdom and nuance and debate, is to say we can't answer it in, a podcast per se.
Right.
But yeah, I do think that there's a lot more to technology than we often assume.
Well, and there's also just kind of the Kohelet approach, Ecclesiastes. Like there are just certain things we don't even know how they work. So there's kind of a healthy agnosticism and then stepping back from those things, which we're very loath to do as entrepreneurial Americans. Like if you can't, or Chinese, it's like anything genetic that we're talking about and wrestling with right now, the Chinese are already working on it in their labs. Right?
Well, and that's an argument that's made often. If we don't do it, someone else can. So we need to do it and do it correctly.
Right.
And I think that by and large works. Especially, you think of the Department of Defense in terms of weapon development things. I've written on this in other contexts and other veins, but even with weapons technology, yes, I do think that there is we should develop certain things, but there might be certain tools that we use that are just not right. We should not pursue them, even if other people do.
So let's talk in Scripture. Where do we see the idea of technology develop? And I'm thinking of a friend of mine, Yoram Hazony, argued in a book, and I don't know if you would count this as technology, but he argued essentially that when Abel becomes a shepherd, he breaks out of the pattern of what, the Lord's work of working the ground, right? And there's like this, ambiguous space where you're like, wait, can you do that? Can you become a shepherd? Like, we've never heard of this before. The Lord works the earth. He sets the man to working the earth. Cain works the earth. Noah later works the earth. Abel is a shepherd. What the heck? Is shepherding a technology?
I think the way Ellul would argue, and I'll have to put kind of my Ellulian hat, he would say it's a technique.
Okay. So this is where that technique distinction seems appropriate.
Yeah, so technique, it's more than just the tool. So it's not just the shovel or the hoe or the iPhone. It's this larger framework, structure to society. So as he rightfully points out, especially as he's engaging, I know you said you want to get there at some point, but propaganda is the term he uses. He says there's two forms of technique at play in propaganda. There's the mechanical technique, the tools themselves, and there's also the psychological technique. And so I think that's a helpful kind of distinction. And so I've heard even scholars, especially some Jewish scholars, have argued that Cain likely used some form of tool. It wasn't just he punched his brother Abel and that's what killed him. He may have had some type of rudimentary kind of tool of some sort.
If you read further into the law, that's what it sounds like. Yeah.
Yeah. And so using a tool, he used a tool for evil that was meant for good. You can kind of even see that kind of paradigm. A lot of Christians, and I think rightfully, go to like the Tower of Babel. I think you kind of can go back even to Cain and Abel, though, and go, it's interesting because God created human beings in his image. He gave them a job to do, and then gave us certain creative abilities that have been manipulated and twisted towards selfish kind of means of what we want and what we desire. So with all that being said, that's not explicit in the text, but I think it's implicit. I think there's some value to that in seeing that there probably was some type of tool that was used. But you see that, and this is something Tony Reinke has pointed out in his book. It's kind of like a biblical theology technology. It's God, Christian, and technology, I think, with Crossway. He kind of pulls a biblical theology of technology and rightfully said in an interview I had with him a while ago, this is not a predominant theme of the scriptures. You don't see a rich biblical theology of technology, but you do see it kind of throughout how men and women of God and not of God use tools for godly, righteous means or ungodly means. But it's also interesting how it's shaping people. It gives a sense of protection. It gives a sense of kind of isolation, or it gives a sense of control or power or authority. And so that kind of theme, and that's something in my own work I haven't been able to develop as much, and I'd like to do more of, is kind of see kind of a biblical theology of technology, because I don't just want to jump to the Tower of Babel and say, well, social media is our Tower of Babel. That's something that happens a lot in this conversation, and I don't think it's actually that helpful to say, well, this is our modern Tower of Babel, because I think every generation would say they had their modern Tower of Babel. our contemporary
Right.
Tower of Babel. So I don't want to, and that's one of the reasons a book that I wrote called Following Jesus in the Digital Age, I don't title it Following Jesus in the Digital Age. There's an intentionality between it's a digital age because there will be more to come.
Yeah.
We get in this, especially today, we get in the sense that all of the issues, all of the questions, all of the challenges we face are somehow novel and new. And my argument, it's my contention that technology is causing us to ask these fundamental questions in light of new opportunities. Or one of the ways I talk about it is technology expands our moral horizons. It's not changing some of the fundamental attitudes and posture of our heart and our desires. What it's doing is giving them new opportunities, new pathways to be expressed. And I think that's some of the ways that technology shapes and forms us. But we're facing tough challenges today. They will face tough challenges in the next 20 or 30 years, and they did face tough challenges in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I mean, read Ellul. He thinks the end of the world's coming, essentially. I mean, I know that's a little glib to say, but I mean, that's kind of the mentality of what he's writing, like, man, this is not getting any better.
Yeah.
This is really, really going downhill really quick, and we need to be aware of that and kind of have that awakening.
There's a lot of omega point thinking, in 1970s theology, which, again, we're thinking about nuclear warfare, again, for the first time in a long time, as a real possibility. And even digital age, I think, well, you had a transistor digital age that goes all the way back to the 1940s, maybe even before that. And then before that, you had your regular old-fashioned digital age where people just counted on their fingers. So where the term digit comes from. Yeah, and it is. Even when I teach Bible, I have to say, like, look, we're reading the Old Testament where one of the largest technological shifts in human history ever happens, and it's recorded here in the text, and the text doesn't directly discuss it. It just assumes you know that it happened, and then it talks about the effects of how the Philistines are pulling a price gouging scheme on iron sharpening because Israelites can't figure out how to do it for some reason. So technology is right there under the surface of a lot of the discussions going on in the text. And I guess that gets me to the issue of technology and the vulnerable, because if I think about how would the Torah, how would Jesus, the apostles think through this issue about various technologies, we've talked about for good or for ill, but I mean, I think the lingering add-on question there is for good or for ill, for whom, right? To whom do we think about? And so, jumping to something like cryptocurrency, you could think of lots of different things, but or pornography, which is sometimes bound up in cryptocurrency. But is there a way in which you say, well, cryptocurrency is, like the most basic one, Bitcoin. It's just a transaction with a ledger. If you just describe it clinically, it really is nothing nefarious whatsoever. It's entirely the use that seems to import the intention upon it. But is there a way in which we talk about technological tools that have to have some inherent built-in buffers for the most vulnerable who are going to encounter those tools? And I think of like a gun has a safety on it, right? So that when you hand it to somebody, it doesn't, go off in their hand or something like that. Which hopefully most good guns wouldn't, but if they're made for the government, they might, from my experience. So how should the role of building in buffers and safeguards for the vulnerable play in the discussion of technology?
Well, it has to. And that's one of the things about the nature of the Christian ethic is the Christian ethic, the way I understand it and describe it, is not a utilitarian ethic. It's not always that the good of the most outweighs the bad for the few type of thing. It's not always the majority wins. One of the center pillars of the Christian ethic, and at least the way I frame it, is the concept of human dignity. As Carl H. Henry would say, love for another is the center of the Christian ethic. This love for another. And specifically, we see that in Matthew 22 of Jesus saying, love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's this outward expression.
I'll just point out he's quoting the Torah there.
Yeah, exactly. He is. I mean, going back to Leviticus, you see that back in Deuteronomy. You see this idea of this outward-facing reality, the way that we interact with God and our relationship with Him and our relationship with other people. And center to our relationship with other people is recognizing their value, dignity, and worth. Recognizing this inherent dignity and value and worth is created as an image bearer of the Almighty God. And we don't have to dig into that per se. So what I'm trying to say, though, is you're exactly right.
Well, hold on. I want
develop.
to stop you here and just dig in, because you don't say we don't have to dig into that. But I do feel like that's exactly what's missing. There's lip service given to that. But, I teach the Old Testament every semester, and I'm struck by how much it demands that Israel really look at the other very carefully and consider themselves as the other. So it's not when the poor get poor. It's when you fall into poverty, when your brother falls into poverty. So I think we talk about it a lot, especially in Christian circles, but I don't think we actually practice this kind of imagination that's demanded by us, which makes sense why we then look at technologies merely as tools here for our use in any kind of utilitarian way possible. So sorry, go on, but I just think that's a very important point.
It is, and that's one of the things that's really interesting to me about kind of the nature of Christian ethics even today, is that often, especially maybe even my own circles, and this just happens kind of even broader evangelicalism as well, is that we often say one thing and we're doing another. And that one of the things I teach my students is that you may have the quote right theology, but your ethic is revealing something either that you don't believe or you believe something different, because our beliefs and our actions should correspond. In our sin, they don't always, but we should seek after that, so that our theology and our ethics, our theology is revealing. Our theology is informing our ethic, and our ethic should be revealing what we truly believe, living consistently, not as hypocrites in that sense. And so if we're going to say that God has created us all in his image, in his very image, and that everyone has inherent value, dignity, and worth, no matter who they are, age, status, race, whatever, that should directly inform how we think about technology. And about the way that technologies, you could say, well, look at all the great things that come with this particular form, but also, there are some negatives, but does that negative is it proportionally kind of outweighed or put on a specific group? Or does it exacerbate certain things? This is one of the things, especially with the pornography debate, is it's a pretty broad debate. There's a lot that goes into it. And I mean, sometimes there's debated connections between sex trafficking and pornography and some of that thing. But you do see the way this kind of pornographic, in some sense, a broader sense of all of society. And one of the things we see is, well, now we have greater access to it. So we should just cut it off. Well, it's not that easy. That's actually one of the chapters we have in here about the debate over banning pornography. Should we just ban it? Well, a lot of people say, oh yeah, we should just ban it. That's a lot harder said than done. So all that being said is, yes, you have to think about the way that technology is maybe indirectly or directly hurting certain groups of people or certain subsets or certain groups within our society, because the Christian ethic doesn't say, well, what's good for the majority always wins. It's not this utilitarian or even consequentialist ethic. Even though we do take in the consequences, we should see in a broader framework. And this is something I do in some of my other work, is seeing the Christian ethic not as just purely deontological, purely consequentialist, or even virtue. Is there something uniquely, wholly different about the Christian ethic, as opposed to a lot of the philosophical alternatives? And so seeing that is that it's something that there's a protection and care for others, specifically even the most vulnerable among us. And I think that's an important framing for even technological developments and policy and how we think through ramifications and what to do about these tools.
Well, if you want more, Jason Thacker has written a book that is very readable, Following Jesus in a Digital Age. And there's a book that we've been talking about, which is a collection of essays by scholars, The Digital Public Square. Jason Thacker, thank you so much for your wisdom and your guidance. And I think we're going to come back to you for more on how this all relates to conspiracy theories later.
For sure. Thank you, Drew.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.